Charlotte Brooks adjusted her tool belt and squinted up at the power lines running along Maple Street. The morning sun cast long shadows across the small town of Pine Ridge, Colorado, population 8,847, where everyone knew everyone and secrets were harder to keep than Christmas presents. She'd been the town's only female electrician for 3 years now, and people had finally stopped asking if she was sure she could handle the job. "Morning, Charlie," called out Mrs. Henderson from her porch, using the nickname that had stuck despite Charlotte's gentle corrections. "The streetlight by the school is flickering again." "I'll add it to the list," Charlotte replied, waving her clipboard. At 36, she had learned to appreciate the simple rhythm of small-town life. Fix what's broken, help where needed, go home to a quiet apartment above Murphy's hardware store, repeat. It was a far cry from her previous existence, but it was safe. What the people of Pine Ridge didn't know was that Charlotte Brooks had once been Dr. Charlotte Brennan, one of the youngest nuclear engineers ever hired by Titan Energy Corporation. 8 years ago, she had worked in sterile laboratories and gleaming corporate offices, designing safety protocols for nuclear waste storage facilities that could contain radioactive materials for thousands of years. That career had ended when she discovered that Titan Energy was cutting corners on waste containment, storing highly radioactive materials in facilities that wouldn't last 50 years, let alone 500. When she tried to report the violations through proper channels, she found that the corruption went all the way to the top. Federal regulators had been bought off, safety inspectors were looking the other way, and the company was quietly dumping nuclear waste in locations that violated every international treaty. Charlotte had made the choice that destroyed her old life and created her new one. She gathered evidence, contacted journalists, and blew the whistle on one of the largest environmental cover-ups in corporate history. For 6 months, she was the most famous scientist in America, testifying before Congress and appearing on every news program. Then Titan Energy's lawyers went to work. They painted her as an unstable employee seeking attention, a disgraced scientist whose own research was questionable. They produced forged documents suggesting she had falsified data, manufactured evidence of her mental instability, and systematically destroyed her credibility. When death threats started arriving at her apartment, when her car's brake lines were cut, when mysterious men began following her, Charlotte understood that staying in the spotlight meant staying in danger. So Dr. Charlotte Brennan had died in a carefully staged car accident, complete with dental records and DNA evidence that satisfied both the police and Titan Energy's surveillance teams. Charlotte Brooks had been born a week later in a small town 2,000 miles away, with a new identity crafted by people who specialized in helping whistleblowers disappear. For 8 years, she had kept her head down, her mouth shut, and her past buried. She fixed electrical problems, attended town meetings, and slowly built a life that felt almost normal. The knowledge that had once made her one of the world's leading nuclear safety experts now helped her wire ceiling fans and troubleshoot circuit breakers. But knowledge, Charlotte had learned, was like radioactive material. It didn't just disappear. It sat in the back of your mind, slowly building up until something triggered it back to life. That trigger came on a Tuesday morning in October when she noticed that her radiation detector was clicking. Charlotte kept the radiation detector hidden in her toolbox, buried under wire strippers and electrical tape. It was a habit from her old life, like checking exit signs when entering buildings or avoiding crowds during rush hour. She'd convinced herself it was just paranoia, a relic of her former existence that she couldn't quite abandon. But the clicking had started 3 days ago, and it was getting louder. She was rewiring the electrical panel at Riverside Elementary School when the detector's rhythm changed from occasional clicks to a steady pattern that made her blood run cold. Charlotte glanced around the empty hallway, then pulled out the small device and watched the needle climb into the yellow zone. Radiation. Low level, but definitely present. Everything okay, Charlie? Principal Martinez appeared in the doorway, coffee cup in hand. You look like you've seen a ghost. Charlotte quickly pocketed the detector and forced a smile. Just checking something. All good here. But it wasn't good. Radiation in a school meant exposure to children, teachers, staff. It meant invisible danger that could cause cancer, birth defects, and death years down the line. Charlotte's engineer brain automatically began calculating exposure rates, mapping potential sources, and running through containment protocols. She finished the wiring job in record time, her hands steady despite the anxiety building in her chest. As soon as she left the school, Charlotte drove to the 3 other locations where she'd noticed the clicking: the town library, the community center, Murphy's hardware store, where she lived. The pattern was unmistakable. Radiation levels were elevated throughout Pine Ridge, centered on the east side of town where the mountains rose toward the old mining district. But Pine Ridge had never been a uranium mining town. The closest nuclear facility was a decommissioned research station 50 miles away in the mountains, shut down 20 years ago and supposedly cleaned up. That evening, Charlotte sat in her apartment with maps spread across her kitchen table. She'd driven to electronics stores in 3 neighboring towns to buy additional radiation detectors, paying cash and using fake names. The readings painted a clear picture. Something was leaking radioactive material into Pine Ridge's environment, and the contamination was spreading. Her phone buzzed with a text from her neighbor, Sarah Kim, who worked as a nurse at Pine Ridge General Hospital. Hey, Charlie, have you noticed more people getting sick lately? We've had a weird spike in nausea, headaches, and fatigue. Dr. Peterson thinks it might be a flu strain, but the symptoms don't quite match. Charlotte stared at the message, her engineer's mind connecting dots that painted a terrifying picture. Nausea, headaches, and fatigue were early symptoms of radiation sickness. The elevated readings around town, the hospital seeing unexplained illnesses, the proximity to the old research station, it all added up to a nightmare scenario. She walked to her window and looked out at Pine Ridge's quiet streets. Families were settling in for the evening, children playing in yards, elderly couples walking their dogs. None of them knew that invisible particles were bombarding their bodies with every breath, every step, every moment they spent in the contamination zone. Charlotte had 2 choices. She could pack her bags and disappear again, find another small town where she could live quietly and safely. Or she could dust off knowledge she'd spent 8 years trying to forget and figure out what was poisoning her adopted home. The decision came easier than she expected. Pine Ridge had given her a new life when she needed one most. These people had accepted her without questions, trusted her with their electrical problems, and treated her like family. She couldn't walk away and let them suffer for something they didn't understand. But investigating meant risking exposure. If word got out that Charlotte Brooks was asking questions about radiation, it wouldn't take long for someone to connect her to Dr. Charlotte Brennan. And if Titan Energy discovered that their most dangerous enemy was still alive, the threats and accidents would start again. Charlotte pulled out her laptop and began researching the old Mountain View research station. According to official records, the facility had been completely decontaminated after its closure in 2003. All radioactive materials had been safely removed and transported to permanent storage sites. The buildings had been demolished, the land had been cleared, and environmental testing had confirmed that no contamination remained. But Charlotte knew how these cleanups worked. She knew how companies cut corners, how regulators could be bought, how dangerous materials could be buried rather than properly disposed of. If someone had taken shortcuts 20 years ago, recent seismic activity in the region could have shifted the ground enough to breach whatever containers were holding the waste. She spent the night reading geological surveys and earthquake reports. 3 weeks ago, a 4.2 magnitude earthquake had struck the area near the old research station. Small by California standards, but potentially large enough to crack containment systems that were never designed to last decades. As dawn broke over Pine Ridge, Charlotte made her decision. She would investigate the source of the radiation, find proof of the contamination, and force authorities to take action. But she would do it carefully, quietly, and with full knowledge that she was risking everything she'd built in her new life. She had been Dr. Charlotte Brennan once, before fear had driven her into hiding. Maybe it was time to remember what that felt like. Charlotte spent the next 2 days conducting what she called routine electrical maintenance throughout Pine Ridge. She used her work as cover to take radiation readings at dozens of locations, mapping the contamination with the precision of someone who had once designed nuclear safety protocols for a living. The pattern became clearer with each measurement. Radiation levels were highest on the eastern edge of town, tapering off as you moved west toward the valley. The contamination followed the natural drainage from the mountains, carried by groundwater and surface runoff from the old research station site. But the most disturbing discovery came when she tested the water. Pine Ridge drew its drinking water from a series of wells that tapped into the mountain aquifer. Charlotte collected samples from the main pumping station, using techniques she remembered from her graduate school days. The results made her hands shake as she read them. Cesium-137, strontium-90, americium-241. A cocktail of radioactive isotopes that had no business being anywhere near a town's water supply. The concentrations were still below acute toxicity levels, but they were climbing steadily. Within months, possibly weeks, the water would become dangerous to drink. Charlotte sat in her truck outside the pumping station, staring at the test results and fighting down panic. 8,000 people were drinking contaminated water, breathing contaminated air, living their lives in a slowly intensifying radiation field. Children were especially vulnerable, their developing bodies absorbing radioactive particles that could cause cancer decades later. She needed help, but who could she trust? Going to local authorities meant risking exposure of her real identity. Federal agencies would take months to investigate if they investigated at all. Environmental groups would want proof she couldn't provide without revealing expertise she wasn't supposed to have. That evening, Charlotte made a decision that surprised her. She called a meeting with 3 people: Sarah Kim from the hospital, Tom Peterson, who ran the water department, and Maria Santos, the school district's maintenance supervisor. All 3 had noticed problems in their areas of responsibility, and all 3 were smart enough to connect dots when shown the right evidence. They met at Sarah's house after her kids were asleep. Charlotte had prepared carefully, organizing her findings in a way that would be convincing without revealing the depth of her knowledge. "I've been noticing some unusual readings around town," she began, spreading printouts across Sarah's kitchen table. "I think we might have a contamination problem." Tom frowned at the radiation measurements. "These numbers don't mean much to me, Charlie." "Where did you get this equipment?" "I bought it online after I started getting headaches during some electrical work," Charlotte lied smoothly. "Thought it might be electromagnetic interference, but these readings suggest something else." Sarah studied the hospital reports Charlotte had requested. The symptom patterns do match low-level radiation exposure. But how would we have radiation in Pine Ridge? There's nothing nuclear around here. "There used to be," Charlotte said, pulling up maps of the old research station. Mountain View Research Station operated for 30 years before being shut down. According to these geological surveys, recent earthquake activity could have compromised whatever waste storage they left behind. Maria looked up sharply. "My husband works for the county, and he mentioned that there have been more maintenance calls in the eastern part of town lately. Electrical shorts, water pressure problems, foundation cracks. He thought it was just aging infrastructure." "It could be," Charlotte said carefully. "But it could also be environmental damage from contamination. The question is, what do we do about it?" The room fell silent as the implications sank in. If Charlotte was right, Pine Ridge was facing an environmental disaster that could take years to clean up and millions of dollars to address properly. But if they waited for official action, people would continue to be exposed to radiation that was steadily increasing. Tom spoke first. We need more proof, official testing, multiple sources, data that can't be questioned. That could take months, Sarah protested. If people are getting sick now, how much sicker will they be by then? And who's going to pay for professional testing? Maria added. The county doesn't have that kind of budget. Charlotte had been expecting these objections. I think I know someone who might help, she said. An environmental consultant who specializes in contamination testing. Someone discreet who won't ask too many questions about how we got our initial readings. The consultant was actually Dr. James Wu, one of Charlotte's former colleagues from her nuclear engineering days. They had worked together on waste disposal protocols and had remained in loose contact through encrypted email channels used by environmental whistleblowers. Charlotte trusted him not to ask uncomfortable questions about her current identity. James arrived in Pine Ridge 3 days later, driving a van full of sophisticated testing equipment and posing as an independent contractor hired by concerned citizens. His official testing confirmed everything Charlotte had discovered and added new alarming details. The contamination was worse than she had thought. Multiple radioactive isotopes were present in concentrations that would trigger federal evacuation protocols in other communities. The source was definitely the old research station, where decades-old waste containers had been breached by recent seismic activity. But the most disturbing finding was the rate of increase. Contamination levels were rising by approximately 15% per week. Within 2 months, radiation exposure in Pine Ridge would reach levels that posed immediate health risks to residents, especially children and pregnant women. This is a federal emergency, James told the group as they reviewed his findings. The EPA needs to be notified immediately, along with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and probably FEMA. Charlotte felt a familiar chill of fear. Federal agencies meant scrutiny, background checks, and questions about how a small-town electrician had managed to detect a radiation leak that had escaped official notice. But they were past the point where she could protect her secret identity, while also protecting the town. There's something else, James continued. The waste storage at Mountain View wasn't supposed to exist. According to federal records, all radioactive materials were removed in 2003. But my analysis suggests that someone buried high-level waste in containers that were never designed for long-term storage. The implications hit Charlotte like a physical blow. Someone had lied about the cleanup, buried nuclear waste illegally, and covered up evidence that could have prevented this disaster. It was Titan Energy all over again. Corporate crime hidden behind regulatory capture and official indifference. But this time, Charlotte wasn't going to run. The call came at 2:47 a.m., dragging Charlotte from uneasy sleep. James Wu's voice was tight with urgency. Charlotte, we have a problem. I submitted the preliminary test results to the EPA this afternoon, and someone made sure they disappeared from the system. When I called to follow up, they told me no such report had been received. Charlotte sat up in bed, instantly alert. What about backup copies? I kept everything, but that's not the point. Someone with serious influence is actively suppressing this information. I've seen this before when big corporations have cleanup liability. They buy silence until they can figure out damage control. Through her apartment window, Charlotte could see the pre-dawn darkness that still covered Pine Ridge. In 6 hours, children would be walking to school through increasingly radioactive air. Families would be drinking contaminated water with their breakfast. Workers would be starting jobs that exposed them to invisible danger. "How long do we have?" she asked. "Based on the contamination increase rate, I'd say 2 weeks before we hit emergency evacuation levels. Maybe less if there's another seismic event that opens up more waste containers." Charlotte made a decision that would have terrified her 8 years ago, but now felt like simple necessity. "James, I need you to do something that's going to put both of us at risk. Can you get testing equipment that's portable enough for me to use?" "What are you planning?" "I'm going to the source. Someone needs to document exactly what's buried up there and how bad the breach is. If federal agencies won't act on preliminary reports, maybe they'll listen to real-time video of nuclear waste leaking into a mountain watershed." James was quiet for a long moment. "Charlotte, the radiation exposure at the source could be lethal. This isn't electrical work anymore. This is a job for hazmat specialists with full protective gear." "Then get me the gear," Charlotte said simply. "And get me communications equipment that can broadcast live video to multiple agencies simultaneously. If we're going to force action, we need to make it impossible to ignore." The next 12 hours transformed Charlotte from a cautious small-town electrician back into the nuclear engineer she had once been. James arrived with equipment that filled the back of his van: radiation suits, breathing apparatus, portable testing gear, and satellite communication systems that could bypass local networks. But before she could investigate the source, Charlotte faced a more immediate crisis. Maria Santos called with news that made her stomach drop. "Charlie, we just got word that Riverside Elementary is being evacuated. 23 kids came down with severe nausea and dizziness during morning classes. The principal called it food poisoning, but the symptoms match acute radiation exposure," Charlotte finished. "How severe?" "Bad enough that they're being taken to Denver Children's Hospital. Sarah went with them. She thinks we're looking at the beginning of widespread radiation sickness." Charlotte closed her eyes, remembering her radiation readings from the school 3 days earlier. The levels had been elevated but not immediately dangerous. That meant contamination was accelerating faster than anyone had predicted. "Maria, I need you to coordinate something for me. Get Tom to shut down the water system. Make up some excuse about maintenance or testing. Get the school district to cancel classes for the rest of the week. And start quietly spreading word that people should consider staying indoors as much as possible." "Charlie, if I do all that, people are going to ask questions. They're going to want to know why." "Then tell them the truth," Charlotte said. "Tell them we have a radiation emergency and that federal help is on the way." "Is it? Federal help?" Charlotte looked at the hazmat gear James was unloading from his van. "It will be. I'm going to make sure of it." That afternoon, Charlotte Brooks ceased to exist. Dr. Charlotte Brennan put on a radiation suit for the first time in 8 years and began the climb toward Mountain View Research Station. The abandoned facility sat at 9,200 feet elevation, accessed by a Forest Service road that had been gated off since 2003. Charlotte cut the lock and drove James's equipment-laden van through terrain that grew more contaminated with every mile. The radiation detector in her suit began clicking rapidly as she approached the research station's perimeter. What she found there was worse than her most pessimistic projections. The cleanup had been a fraud. Instead of properly disposing of nuclear waste, someone had simply buried it in hundreds of metal containers scattered across the mountainside. 20 years of freeze-thaw cycles, combined with recent seismic activity, had split many of the containers open. Radioactive sludge was leaking directly into the soil, carried by mountain streams toward Pine Ridge's watershed. Charlotte documented everything with cameras that broadcast live to servers James had set up in 6 different states. She took soil samples, water samples, and air readings that painted a comprehensive picture of environmental disaster. But the most damning evidence came when she found the burial records. Hidden in a deteriorating filing cabinet inside the abandoned administration building were documents that proved the illegal waste disposal. Hundreds of pages detailed the burial of high-level radioactive materials that should have been transported to permanent federal storage sites. The records showed payments to inspectors, forged disposal certificates, and a systematic cover-up that had saved millions of dollars in proper cleanup costs. The company responsible for the fraudulent cleanup was Titan Energy Corporation. Charlotte stared at the familiar logo on the document headers, feeling 8 years of suppressed anger finally breaking free. The same corporation that had destroyed her life, threatened her safety, and forced her into exile had also poisoned an entire mountain community. They had committed environmental crimes that could kill thousands of people over the coming decades. But this time, Charlotte had evidence that couldn't be suppressed, discredited, or buried. Live video feeds, real-time radiation readings, and documentary proof of corporate crime were being broadcast to environmental groups, federal agencies, and news organizations simultaneously. As she prepared to leave the contamination site, Charlotte's communication system crackled with incoming calls. The EPA was demanding immediate access to her data. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission was launching an emergency investigation. Environmental groups were calling for criminal prosecution. Most importantly, FEMA was mobilizing an emergency response team to coordinate evacuation procedures for Pine Ridge. Charlotte had done what she'd set out to do. The federal cavalry was finally coming. But as she drove back down the mountain toward town, she realized that her biggest challenge wasn't over. It was just beginning. The evacuation of Pine Ridge began at dawn on Friday, coordinated by FEMA teams that had driven through the night from Denver. Charlotte watched from her apartment window as school buses and emergency vehicles lined up on Main Street, preparing to transport 8,847 people to temporary shelters in neighboring counties. Her phone had been ringing constantly since the previous evening. Reporters wanted interviews, federal agents wanted depositions, and environmental lawyers wanted to discuss criminal prosecutions. But the call that mattered most came from Sarah Kim at the hospital in Denver. "Charlie, the kids from the school are going to be okay. The radiation exposure was significant, but not life-threatening. The doctors are amazed at how quickly we caught it. They said another week or two of exposure could have caused permanent damage." Charlotte leaned against her kitchen counter, feeling relief flood through her body. What about the other symptoms around town? Early-stage radiation sickness, mostly. Treatable if people get away from the source quickly enough. The evacuation came just in time. Just in time. Charlotte thought about the 2 weeks of investigation, the careful testing, the risk of exposing her real identity. If she had remained silent, if she had chosen safety over action, Pine Ridge's children would be facing cancer treatments instead of temporary evacuation. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Agent Rebecca Torres from the EPA, flanked by 2 federal marshals and a man in an expensive suit who looked like corporate legal representation. "Ms. Brooks," Agent Torres said formally, "we need to ask you some questions about how you obtained the radiation testing equipment and expertise that led to this evacuation." Charlotte had been expecting this moment since she'd first pulled out her radiation detector. Federal investigations meant background checks, and background checks would reveal that Charlotte Brooks had appeared out of nowhere 8 years ago, with no verifiable history before that. "I'd be happy to answer your questions," she said, stepping aside to let them enter her apartment. The expensive suit introduced himself as Richard Hammond, legal counsel for Titan Energy Corporation. "Ms. Brooks, my client is concerned about allegations of environmental crime that appear to be based on illegally obtained evidence. We'd like to understand how a small-town electrician managed to conduct sophisticated nuclear contamination testing." Charlotte looked at him steadily. I had help from qualified experts. Yes, doctor. James Wu has been very helpful, Agent Torres interjected. But Dr. Wu tells us that you provided the initial readings that led to his involvement. He also says you demonstrated knowledge of nuclear safety protocols that goes well beyond what an electrician would normally possess. The moment of truth had arrived. Charlotte could continue the fiction, claim she'd learned everything online, and hope her false identity held up under scrutiny. Or she could step back into the light and face whatever consequences came with being doctor. Charlotte Brennan again. She walked to her kitchen table and opened her laptop, pulling up files she hadn't accessed in 8 years. Massachusetts Institute of Technology doctoral dissertation. Nuclear engineering certification. Employment records from 3 major research facilities. Published papers on radioactive waste containment. And correspondence from her work at Titan Energy Corporation, including early warnings about unsafe waste disposal practices. My name isn't Charlotte Brooks, she said quietly. It's Dr. Charlotte Brennan. I worked for Titan Energy from 2008 to 2015 as a nuclear safety engineer. I was forced to disappear after I exposed illegal waste disposal practices that the company was using to avoid proper cleanup costs. Hammond's face went white. Agent Torres sat forward, suddenly very interested. The federal marshals moved closer to Charlotte, hands near their weapons. You're supposed to be dead, Hammond said. Yes, Charlotte agreed. Your client made sure of that. After I testified about Titan Energy's illegal practices, your lawyers destroyed my credibility and your security. People made it clear that my life was in danger if I continued speaking out. So Dr. Charlotte Brennan died in a car accident, and Charlotte Brooks was born. She turned her laptop screen toward Agent Torres. Everything you need is in these files. Documentation of Titan Energy's illegal waste disposal practices, correspondence proving that company executives knew they were violating federal law, and evidence that the Mountain View cleanup was fraudulent from the beginning. Agent Torres scrolled through the documents, her expression growing more serious with each page. Dr. Brennan, why didn't you come forward with this evidence years ago? Because I was afraid, Charlotte said simply. Titan Energy has unlimited resources and no morals. They proved they could destroy someone who challenged them, and I wasn't brave enough to face that again. Until now. What changed? Torres asked. Charlotte gestured toward the window, where evacuation buses were loading Pine Ridge families with their hastily packed belongings. Those people gave me a home when I needed one. They trusted me with their electrical problems, invited me to community events, and treated me like family. When I realized they were in danger from the same company that destroyed my life, I couldn't stay silent anymore. Hammond was frantically typing on his phone, probably alerting Titan Energy's crisis management team that their most dangerous enemy had returned from the dead. But Charlotte wasn't afraid anymore. 8 years of hiding had taught her that living in fear wasn't really living at all. Dr. Brennan, Agent Torres said formally, I'm placing you in federal protective custody pending a full investigation of these allegations. Given the evidence you've provided and the scope of the environmental crime we're investigating, I believe you may be in significant danger. From Titan Energy? From multiple sources. This investigation is going to destroy careers, end lucrative contracts, and potentially result in criminal prosecutions at the highest levels of corporate and government leadership. The people responsible have billions of dollars at stake. Charlotte nodded, understanding the implications. But as she packed her few belongings, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 8 years. Hope. For the first time since her old life ended, she was fighting back instead of running away. The congressional hearing convened 3 weeks later in a packed committee room in Washington, D.C. Charlotte sat at the witness table, facing a panel of senators whose expressions ranged from sympathetic to skeptical. Behind her, rows of reporters, environmental activists, and corporate lawyers created an atmosphere of barely controlled tension. Committee Chairman Senator Patricia Williams opened the hearing with words that made Charlotte's heart race. Dr. Brennan, you have alleged that Titan Energy Corporation engaged in systematic environmental crime over a period of decades, resulting in nuclear contamination that endangered thousands of American citizens. These are serious charges that could result in criminal prosecution and billions of dollars in liability. Tell this committee, in your own words, what you discovered at Mountain View Research Station. Charlotte had spent 3 weeks preparing for this moment, working with EPA investigators to organize evidence that painted a comprehensive picture of corporate environmental crime. But sitting under the bright lights, facing cameras that would broadcast her testimony around the world, she felt the weight of 8 years of silence finally lifting. Senator Williams, members of the committee, she began. What I discovered at Mountain View was the largest environmental cover-up I have encountered in my 20-year career as a nuclear engineer. She walked the committee through her findings methodically. The fraudulent cleanup records, the illegal burial of high-level radioactive waste, and the systematic bribery of federal inspectors that had allowed the crime to continue for decades. Charts and graphs displayed radiation levels, contamination maps, and projections showing how the disaster would have unfolded if the evacuation hadn't occurred. The containers buried at Mountain View were never designed for long-term storage, Charlotte testified. They were essentially industrial garbage cans filled with some of the most dangerous materials on Earth. Titan Energy knew they would fail within decades, but they buried them anyway because proper disposal would have cost hundreds of millions of dollars. Senator Michael Rodriguez, the committee's ranking Republican member, leaned forward with obvious skepticism. Dr. Brennan, you admit that you have been living under a false identity for 8 years. You have a clear motive to make accusations against Titan Energy. Why should this committee believe testimony from someone who has been deliberately deceiving federal authorities? Charlotte had expected this line of attack. Senator Rodriguez, I understand your skepticism, but the evidence speaks for itself. EPA testing has confirmed every measurement I took. FBI forensic accountants have verified the financial records I discovered. And 3 former Titan Energy executives have now come forward to corroborate my testimony about the company's illegal practices. She paused, choosing her words carefully. I lived under a false identity because Titan Energy made it clear that telling the truth about their practices was incompatible with staying alive. But when I realized that their crimes were poisoning an entire community, I decided that some truths are worth the risk. The hearing's most dramatic moment came when Senator Williams introduced recorded phone conversations between Titan Energy executives discussing the Mountain View cover-up. The recordings, obtained through FBI wiretaps, captured company officials joking about burying problems and celebrating the money saved through illegal waste disposal. In one particularly damning conversation, Titan Energy CEO Marcus Kane could be heard saying, "The Brennan problem is handled. She won't be causing us any more trouble. And if the Mountain View site starts leaking in 20 years, we'll blame it on natural disasters and pay off whoever needs to be paid off." Hammond, representing Titan Energy, objected strenuously to the recording's admission, but the damage was done. The committee room erupted in angry murmurs as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. Senator Williams called for order, then addressed Charlotte directly. Dr. Brennan, what would have happened to Pine Ridge if you hadn't discovered the radiation leak? Charlotte consulted her notes, though she knew the numbers by heart. Based on contamination increase rates, we would have seen acute radiation sickness within 6 weeks. Childhood cancer rates would have increased by approximately 300% over the next decade. the contamination would have spread to neighboring communities through groundwater, affecting an estimated 50,000 people across 3 counties. And the long-term effects? Thousands of deaths from cancer over the next 50 years, birth defects affecting multiple generations, an environmental disaster that would have taken decades and billions of dollars to clean up. The hearing continued for 2 more days, with testimony from EPA officials, medical experts, and Pine Ridge residents who described their experiences during the evacuation. Sarah Kim testified about the children who had developed radiation sickness. Tom Peterson explained how the contaminated water system had been shut down just days before it would have reached dangerous levels. But the most powerful testimony came from 12-year-old Emma Harrison, one of the students who had been evacuated from Riverside Elementary. Her mother had allowed her to testify via video link, and her simple words carried more impact than hours of technical evidence. "I don't understand why companies are allowed to poison kids," Emma said, looking directly into the camera. "Ms. Brooks saved our lives by telling the truth. Why did she have to hide for so long before anyone would listen?" The hearing concluded with Senator Williams announcing that the committee would recommend criminal prosecution of Titan Energy executives, federal investigation of regulatory failures, and compensation for Pine Ridge residents affected by the contamination. But for Charlotte, the real victory came in a phone call she received that evening. Pine Ridge's mayor calling to tell her that the town council had voted unanimously to offer her the position of public works director when residents were allowed to return home. The job comes with a house, full benefits, and the respect of everyone in Pine Ridge, Mayor Thompson said. "We know who you really are now, Doctor Brennan, and we want you to stay." Charlotte looked out the window of her Washington hotel room at the city lights, thinking about the choice between returning to her quiet life as Charlotte Brooks or embracing her identity as Dr. Charlotte Brennan again. The decision was easier than she expected. 6 months later, Charlotte stood on the main street of Pine Ridge, watching the last of the decontamination crews pack up their equipment. The town looked different now. Newer signs, fresh paint on buildings, and sophisticated environmental monitoring systems that hadn't existed before the evacuation. But the heart of the community remained unchanged. "Dr. Brennan," Emma Harrison ran up the street, her backpack bouncing as she approached. At 13, she had become something of a local celebrity, having testified before Congress and appeared on several news programs. "My science teacher wants to know if you'll come speak to our class about nuclear engineering." Charlotte smiled, adjusting to the title she was still getting used to, after 8 years as Charlotte Brooks, being called doctor. Brennan felt strange but increasingly comfortable. "I'd be happy to, but remember, the most important thing I can teach you isn't about nuclear engineering." "What is it?" "That speaking up when you see something wrong is always worth the risk." Emma nodded seriously, then ran off to join her friends. Charlotte watched her go, remembering her own enthusiasm for science at that age, before she learned how complicated the world could be for people who insisted on telling inconvenient truths. The Titan Energy criminal trials had concluded the previous month with convictions for environmental crimes, conspiracy, and racketeering. CEO Marcus Kane received a 20-year federal prison sentence, while other executives faced sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years. The company itself had been fined $2.8 billion and faced bankruptcy proceedings that would liquidate its assets to pay for environmental cleanup and victim compensation. Charlotte's role in exposing the crimes had made her something of a reluctant celebrity in environmental circles. She received speaking invitations from universities, consulting offers from law firms, and job opportunities with federal agencies. But she had turned them all down to return to Pine Ridge as Director of Environmental Safety, a position created specifically for her. "Any regrets about not taking that EPA job in Washington?" Sarah Kim asked as they walked past the new community center. Sarah had been promoted to chief of staff at Pine Ridge General Hospital, which had been rebuilt with state-of-the-art medical equipment purchased with settlement funds from Titan Energy. None, Charlotte replied honestly. I spent 8 years running from my past. Now I'm finally building a future. The town itself had been transformed by the settlement money and federal investment in environmental restoration. The old water system had been completely rebuilt with advanced filtration technology. Solar panels and wind turbines provided clean energy to every building. A new environmental science center offered educational programs about radiation safety and environmental protection. But the most significant change was in the people. The shared experience of evacuation and return had strengthened community bonds that were already strong. Neighbors looked out for each other more carefully. Local government meetings drew larger crowds of engaged citizens. And there was a new appreciation for the importance of environmental monitoring and citizen oversight. Tom Peterson, now Pine Ridge's Director of Public Works, joined Charlotte and Sarah as they reached the town square. The latest water quality reports came back clean, he announced. 6 months of testing, and we're consistently well below federal safety standards for everything. What about the mountain site? Sarah asked. Fully contained, Charlotte said. The Army Corps of Engineers finished the permanent containment structure last month. All radioactive materials have been excavated and transported to proper federal storage facilities. It'll take another year of monitoring to be completely sure, but the contamination source has been eliminated. They paused at the memorial that had been erected in the town square, honoring the federal investigators and environmental specialists who had worked to save Pine Ridge. A bronze plaque bore the names of everyone who had contributed to exposing the contamination, with a simple inscription, "Truth is the foundation of safety." As evening approached, Charlotte walked home to the house the town had provided for her. A modest 2-story building with a view of the mountains and enough space for the home laboratory where she continued her environmental monitoring work. It wasn't the corporate apartment she'd once owned in New York, but it felt more like home than anywhere she'd lived since childhood. Her phone buzzed with a text from James Wu, who had parlayed his work in Pine Ridge into a consulting company that specialized in environmental crime investigation. Charlotte, we've got a situation in Oregon that looks familiar. Small farming community, mysterious illnesses, possible industrial contamination. Interested in taking a look? Charlotte smiled as she typed her response. Send me the details. I'll see what I can find. Dr. Charlotte Brennan was back in business. 1 year later, Charlotte stood before a packed auditorium at the University of Colorado, delivering the keynote address at the National Environmental Safety Conference. The audience included EPA officials, environmental engineers, corporate executives, and student activists who saw her as a symbol of scientific integrity in an era of corporate influence. The greatest danger to environmental safety, she told the audience, isn't ignorance or lack of technology. It's the willingness to prioritize short-term profits over long-term consequences, and the silence of people who know better but are afraid to speak up. In the front row sat Emma Harrison, now 14, and already planning to study environmental engineering in college. Next to her were Sarah Kim, Tom Peterson, and Mayor Thompson, who had driven down from Pine Ridge to support Charlotte's first major public speaking engagement since her return to public life. 8 years ago, Charlotte continued, I made a choice to remain silent rather than continue fighting corporate environmental crime. I told myself it was about personal safety, but the truth was simpler. I was tired of being the person who always brought bad news. I wanted a quiet life where I could fix small problems instead of confronting large ones. She paused, looking out at the audience of scientists and policymakers who held the future of environmental protection in their hands. But silence in the face of environmental crime isn't neutrality. It's complicity. Every day we choose not to speak up about contamination, illegal dumping, or regulatory capture is another day that communities like Pine Ridge are put at risk. The speech concluded to sustained applause, but Charlotte's real satisfaction came from the conversations afterward. Young engineers approached her with questions about how to balance career concerns with ethical obligations. EPA officials asked for advice on protecting whistleblowers. Corporate executives, surprisingly, wanted to discuss how to build compliance programs that actually worked instead of just providing legal cover. But the most meaningful conversation came with Dr. Maria Vasquez, a recent PhD in environmental engineering who had been inspired by Charlotte's story to pursue a career in contamination detection and cleanup. Dr. Brennan, Maria said, I've been following your work since the Pine Ridge case. I'm starting a research program on early detection of environmental contamination. Would you consider joining as a consultant? Charlotte smiled, remembering her own early enthusiasm for solving environmental problems through rigorous science and principled action. I'd be honored to help, but remember, the technology is the easy part. The hard part is having the courage to act on what you discover. As the conference ended, Charlotte walked outside into the Colorado evening with her Pine Ridge friends. The mountains rose around them, reminding her of the view from her apartment above Murphy's hardware store, where this journey had really begun. Any regrets about leaving the quiet life behind? Mayor Thompson asked. Charlotte thought about the question seriously. In the year since Pine Ridge's evacuation, she had testified before 3 congressional committees, consulted on 4 environmental crime investigations, and helped establish new federal protocols for protecting environmental whistleblowers. Her quiet life as Charlotte Brooks, small-town electrician, was definitively over. None, she said finally. Hiding taught me the value of peace, but it also taught me that some problems are too important to ignore. I'm not running anymore. Sarah Kim smiled. Good thing, because we've got another situation developing. Tom found some unusual readings in the water system last week. Nothing dangerous yet, but worth investigating, Charlotte finished. Send me the data when we get back. As they drove north toward Pine Ridge, Charlotte reflected on the journey that had brought her from Dr. Charlotte Brennan to Charlotte Brooks and back again. The woman who had once been too afraid to fight corporate power had become someone who actively sought out environmental battles that others wanted to avoid. But perhaps most importantly, she had learned that heroism wasn't about being fearless. It was about being afraid and acting anyway, because some truths were too important to leave buried. The lights of Pine Ridge appeared in the distance, welcoming her home to a community that had been saved by one person's willingness to step out of the shadows and back into the light. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new investigations, and new opportunities to protect communities from those who would poison them for profit. Dr. Charlotte Brennan was ready for all of it. 2 years after the Pine Ridge evacuation, Charlotte found herself at the center of a growing network of environmental investigators, whistleblowers, and communities fighting corporate contamination. The Pine Ridge Environmental Research Center had become a model for citizen-led environmental monitoring, with similar facilities being established in 12 states. Dr. Brennan called out Dr. Marcus Chen, the center's new director of data analysis, as Charlotte reviewed the morning's reports from monitoring stations throughout the Rocky Mountain region. We've got 3 new cases this week: industrial pollution in Michigan, illegal dumping in Texas, and what looks like another nuclear waste situation in Nevada. Charlotte looked up from her computer, where she'd been analyzing patterns in groundwater contamination that suggested a coordinated effort by multiple corporations to hide environmental crimes in rural communities. Send me the Nevada file first. Nuclear waste takes priority. The center buzzed with activity as 23 full-time staff members worked on cases that ranged from local water contamination to international environmental crime syndicates. What had started as Charlotte's desperate attempt to save one small town had evolved into one of the country's most effective environmental protection organizations. Emma Harrison, now 16 and working part-time at the center while finishing high school, approached Charlotte's desk with a tablet full of data. "Dr. Brennan, I've been analyzing the pattern recognition software we developed, and I think I've found something important." Charlotte smiled as she accepted the tablet. Emma had grown into a remarkably gifted young scientist, combining natural intelligence with the kind of moral clarity that couldn't be taught. Her work on automated contamination detection had already been featured in 3 peer-reviewed journals. What did you find? The software identified a pattern in corporate waste disposal that suggests systematic coordination between companies that are supposed to be competitors, Emma explained, pulling up maps and charts that showed contamination sites across the western United States. "Look at the timing and locations. It's too organized to be coincidental." Charlotte studied the data with growing concern. Emma was right. The pattern suggested that major corporations were sharing information about illegal disposal sites, coordinating their environmental crimes to minimize detection and maximize cost savings. This could be evidence of a criminal conspiracy involving dozens of companies, Charlotte said quietly. "If you're right, we're looking at environmental racketeering on a scale that makes Titan Energy look like a small-time operation." Before Emma could respond, Charlotte's secure phone rang with an urgent call from Agent Rebecca Torres, who had been promoted to Director of Environmental Crimes at the EPA following her work on the Titan Energy case. "Charlotte, we need to talk immediately," Torres said without preamble. "We've been monitoring corporate communications as part of the ongoing Titan Energy investigation, and we've discovered something that changes everything." "What kind of something?" "The kind that suggests Pine Ridge wasn't an isolated incident. We think there's a coordinated network of companies systematically contaminating rural communities and covering up the evidence. And based on the communications we've intercepted, they know you're investigating them." Charlotte felt a familiar chill of danger, but this time it was tempered by 8 years of experience and a network of allies who could help her fight back. "How serious is the threat?" "Serious enough that I'm sending a protection detail to Pine Ridge within the hour. Charlotte, these people have killed before, and they're not going to let you expose their entire operation without a fight." As Charlotte hung up the phone, she realized that her personal battle with Titan Energy had been just the beginning. What she had uncovered in Pine Ridge was part of a much larger criminal enterprise that threatened communities across the country. But she wasn't the frightened whistleblower who had gone into hiding 8 years ago. She had allies now, resources, and most importantly, a community that believed in fighting for truth, regardless of the personal cost. "Emma," she said, turning back to the young scientist, "I need you to copy all of your pattern recognition data to our secure servers and then go home. Things are about to get dangerous around here." "Dr. Brennan, if there's danger, shouldn't I stay and help?" Charlotte smiled, remembering her own eagerness to fight injustice at Emma's age. "You are helping. The work you've done could expose the biggest environmental crime syndicate in American history. But right now, the best way you can help is by staying safe while the adults handle the immediate threat." As Emma reluctantly gathered her materials, Charlotte began implementing security protocols she'd hoped never to use again. The Pine Ridge Environmental Research Center was about to become the target of corporations with unlimited resources and no moral boundaries. But this time, Charlotte wasn't facing them alone. Chapter 10: The Syndicate Strikes Back. The attack came at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, precisely when corporate security analysts had calculated that the Pine Ridge Environmental Research Center would be most vulnerable. But they had underestimated both Charlotte's paranoia and the loyalty of a small town that had learned the value of protecting those who fought for truth. Charlotte's security system, designed by former FBI cybersecurity specialists, detected the breach attempt within seconds. Instead of triggering obvious alarms, it activated a network of hidden cameras and began recording everything while silently alerting Charlotte, local law enforcement, and federal agents who were already en route from Denver. The infiltration team consisted of 6 professionals in black tactical gear, carrying equipment designed to plant evidence of terrorist activity in Charlotte's laboratory. If their mission succeeded, Charlotte would be arrested as a domestic terrorist. Her research would be discredited, and the environmental crime syndicate would eliminate their most dangerous enemy through legal manipulation rather than obvious violence. But Pine Ridge had learned to watch out for its own. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who had greeted Charlotte every morning for 3 years, lived across the street from the research center and hadn't slept well since her arthritis started acting up. She saw the unmarked van pull up and watched 6 figures in military gear exit with obvious hostile intent. Instead of calling 911, she called Tom Peterson directly. "Tom, there are armed men breaking into Charlie's building," she whispered into her phone. "They don't look like any federal agents I've ever seen." Tom's response was immediate and decisive. "Mrs. Henderson, get away from your windows and call everyone on the phone tree. Tell them code red for Dr. Brennan." The phone tree was an informal network that had developed organically after the evacuation, connecting residents who wanted to protect their community from future threats. Within 15 minutes, 47 pickup trucks were converging on the research center from every direction, their drivers armed with hunting rifles and cell phone cameras. The corporate infiltration team found themselves surrounded by angry citizens who had no intention of letting outsiders threaten the woman who had saved their town. Spotlights from a dozen vehicles illuminated the area like daylight, while live streams from multiple phones broadcast the confrontation to social media platforms and news organizations. "This is Sheriff Martinez," came the voice over a bullhorn as law enforcement vehicles arrived on scene. "You are trespassing on private property and are surrounded by federal agents and local law enforcement. Drop your weapons and surrender immediately." The infiltration team's leader, a former military contractor named Derek Walsh, realized that their operation had been compromised beyond recovery. The evidence-planting mission required stealth and deniability, neither of which was possible with dozens of witnesses and live video coverage. "Stand down," he ordered his team through their tactical radios. "Mission abort. We're blown." But Agent Torres, monitoring the situation from a command vehicle parked 2 blocks away, had different plans. "All units, move in. We're taking them alive. I want to know who hired them and what they were planning to plant." The arrest was swift and professional, but the real victory came in the evidence recovered from the infiltration team's equipment. Digital files revealed plans to plant radioactive materials in Charlotte's laboratory, fabricated documents linking her to terrorist organizations, and communication records showing coordination with executives from 17 major corporations. "Charlotte," Torres said as dawn broke over Pine Ridge, "what we found in their van is enough to bring down the entire syndicate. These people were planning to frame you for nuclear terrorism while simultaneously eliminating evidence of their own environmental crimes." Charlotte stood in her laboratory, looking at the equipment that had nearly been contaminated with planted evidence designed to destroy her credibility and send her to federal prison for life. How many companies are involved? Based on the communication intercepts, at least 23 major corporations across multiple industries. Chemical companies, mining operations, nuclear facilities, pharmaceutical manufacturers. They've been coordinating illegal waste disposal for over a decade. The scope of the criminal conspiracy was staggering. The syndicate had been systematically contaminating rural communities across the United States, sharing disposal sites and cover-up techniques to minimize costs and detection risks. Rural communities were targeted specifically because they lacked the political influence and resources to fight back effectively. "What's our next move?" Charlotte asked. Torres smiled grimly. "We use their own evidence against them. The communication intercepts give us probable cause for search warrants on every company involved. The Justice Department is coordinating simultaneous raids on corporate headquarters in 14 states. By noon today, we'll have enough evidence to prosecute the largest environmental crime syndicate in American history." But even as federal agents prepared to dismantle the corporate conspiracy, Charlotte knew that the victory came with a price. She had stepped so far into the spotlight that returning to anonymity was no longer possible. From now on, she would be a permanent target for corporations that viewed environmental protection as a threat to their profits. "Torres," she said, as federal agents began processing the arrested infiltrators, "I need to ask you something. If we win this, if we actually bring down the entire syndicate, what happens next? There will always be another corporation willing to poison communities for profit." Agent Torres considered the question seriously. "Then we build systems that make it impossible for them to operate in secret. Monitoring networks, whistleblower protections, citizen oversight programs. We change the game so that environmental crime becomes too risky and too expensive to attempt." Charlotte nodded, understanding that her personal battle had become something much larger. The fight for environmental justice wasn't something that could be won once and forgotten. It required constant vigilance, institutional change, and people willing to sacrifice personal safety for the greater good. But looking around at the Pine Ridge residents who had spontaneously organized to protect her, Charlotte realized she wasn't carrying that burden alone anymore. Chapter 11. Justice Served. 6 months later, Charlotte stood in the same congressional hearing room where she had first testified about Titan Energy's crimes, but this time the scope was infinitely larger. The hearing on environmental racketeering and corporate conspiracy had drawn international attention as prosecutors detailed the largest environmental crime prosecution in world history. "Dr. Brennan," Senator Williams began, "your investigation that started with contamination in Pine Ridge has now resulted in criminal charges against 347 corporate executives from 23 companies. Can you explain to this committee how one small town's radiation leak revealed a conspiracy of this magnitude?" Charlotte looked out at the packed hearing room, seeing familiar faces from Pine Ridge mixed with environmental activists, reporters, and corporate lawyers whose clients faced decades in federal prison. "Senator Williams, what we discovered was that environmental crime had become systematized. These companies weren't just cutting corners on waste disposal. They were actively coordinating their illegal activities to maximize profits and minimize detection. The evidence presented over 3 days of hearings was overwhelming. Corporate executives had shared contamination sites, coordinated bribery of federal inspectors, and even developed sophisticated software for identifying rural communities that lacked the political influence to fight back against environmental crime." Emma Harrison, now 17 and the youngest person ever to testify before a congressional committee on environmental crime, presented her pattern recognition analysis that had first identified the conspiracy. "These companies treated environmental crime like any other business collaboration," she testified. "They shared best practices for illegal dumping, coordinated their political lobbying to weaken environmental regulations, and systematically targeted communities they considered disposable." The hearings revealed that the syndicate had contaminated over 200 communities across 31 states, affecting an estimated 750,000 people. The health impacts included thousands of cancer cases, birth defects in multiple generations, and environmental damage that would take decades to remediate. But perhaps the most damning testimony came from Dr. Janet Morrison, former chief scientist at Chemcorp Industries, who had been part of the conspiracy for 12 years before developing a conscience. "We called it the rural solution," Morrison testified, her voice barely audible in the packed hearing room. "The idea was simple. Rural communities couldn't afford the legal resources to fight contamination, and they lacked the political influence to force regulatory action. We could dispose of hazardous waste in these areas for a fraction of the cost of proper treatment." "And if communities became suspicious?" Senator Rodriguez asked. "We had protocols for that too. Legal intimidation, character assassination of local activists, and if necessary, we would relocate our operations and cover up the evidence." The Pine Ridge case was supposed to be handled through legal intimidation and evidence destruction, but Dr. Brennan's investigation moved too quickly for our usual methods. The criminal trials that followed the hearings resulted in unprecedented sentences for environmental crime. Marcus Kane, already serving 20 years for the Titan Energy case, received an additional life sentence for his role in coordinating the syndicate. Other executives received sentences ranging from 15 to 40 years in federal prison. More importantly, the corporate fines and civil settlements totaled $47 billion, with funds designated for environmental cleanup and victim compensation. The syndicate's coordinated assets were liquidated to pay for the largest environmental remediation program in American history. But for Charlotte, the real victory wasn't in the courtroom. It was in the legislation that emerged from the hearings. The Environmental Justice and Community Protection Act established a new federal agency dedicated to investigating environmental crime, with offices in every state and legal authority to prosecute corporate executives for environmental terrorism. The act also created a national environmental monitoring network, staffed by local citizens trained in contamination detection. "Dr. Brennan," Senator Williams said as the hearings concluded, "Congress is prepared to offer you the position of director of the new Environmental Crimes Investigation Agency. The job comes with a budget of $500 million annually and the authority to investigate environmental crime anywhere in the United States." Charlotte considered the offer seriously. Leading a federal agency would give her unprecedented power to protect communities from environmental crime. But it would also mean leaving Pine Ridge, abandoning the grassroots approach that had made her work so effective. "Senator Williams, I'm honored by the offer, but I have to decline. The most important work in environmental protection happens at the community level, not in Washington offices. I'd like to continue building the citizen monitoring network that started in Pine Ridge." The senator smiled, seemingly unsurprised by Charlotte's response. "In that case, Congress is prepared to fund the National Community Environmental Monitoring Program with Dr. Charlotte Brennan as its director. You'll have the resources of a federal agency, but the flexibility to work directly with communities across the country." This time, Charlotte didn't hesitate. "I accept." The Pine Ridge Environmental Research Center had grown into a campus of 6 buildings, training over 500 community environmental monitors annually and maintaining contamination surveillance across 12 western states. Charlotte stood in her office, reviewing reports from monitoring stations that now covered every watershed in the Rocky Mountain region. At 46, she had become one of the most recognizable environmental scientists in the world, but she still lived in the same modest house that Pine Ridge had provided for her 10 years earlier. The difference was that now she shared it with Dr. James Wu, who had moved to Pine Ridge 2 years earlier when their professional collaboration had evolved into something more personal. "Charlotte," James called from the kitchen, where he was preparing breakfast. "Emma's interview with MIT is this morning. Are you nervous?" Charlotte smiled as she walked downstairs, passing walls covered with photos from environmental investigations across the country. Emma Harrison had become the first person from Pine Ridge ever accepted to MIT's doctoral program in environmental engineering, following in Charlotte's footsteps but determined to exceed her mentor's achievements. She'll be fine, Charlotte said, accepting a cup of coffee. Emma's been ready for MIT since she was 14. The question is whether MIT is ready for Emma. The past 10 years had transformed not just Pine Ridge, but environmental protection across the United States. The community monitoring network had expanded to include 2,300 towns and cities, staffed by citizens trained to detect contamination, and empowered to force immediate federal intervention when problems were discovered. Corporate environmental crime hadn't disappeared, but it had become infinitely more difficult and expensive. The certainty of detection and prosecution had forced companies to invest in proper waste disposal rather than risk criminal sanctions that could destroy their executives' freedom and their shareholders' wealth. Charlotte's phone buzzed with a message from Agent Torres, now director of the Environmental Crimes Investigation Agency. Charlotte, we've got a situation developing in Alaska. Mining company, possible groundwater contamination, native communities at risk. Interested in taking a look? Charlotte smiled as she typed her response. Send me the details. I'll be there by tomorrow afternoon. Some things never changed. There would always be another corporation willing to poison communities for profit, another cover-up to expose, another fight for environmental justice that required someone willing to risk everything for the truth. But Charlotte had learned that heroism wasn't a solitary endeavor. It was built through communities of people who understood that some battles were too important to fight alone. As she prepared for another investigation in another threatened community, Charlotte reflected on the journey that had brought her from Dr. Charlotte Brennan to Charlotte Brooks and back again. The woman who had once been too afraid to fight corporate power had become someone who actively sought out environmental battles that others wanted to avoid. But perhaps most importantly, she had learned that real change didn't come from individual heroism. It came from building systems that empowered ordinary people to protect their communities, networks that connected isolated fights into coordinated movements, and institutions that made environmental justice a permanent part of American democracy. The phone rang with another call about another contamination case in another community that needed protection. Charlotte answered immediately, ready for whatever challenge came next. The fight for environmental justice continued, one investigation at a time, one community at a time, one truth at a time. And Charlotte Brooks, Dr. Charlotte Brennan, had never been more certain that she was exactly where she belonged. Some battles, she had learned, were too important not to fight. Some truths were too dangerous to leave buried, and some communities were worth any risk to protect. The work continued, and Charlotte was ready for all of it. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We'd love to hear what inspired you the most. And where in the world are you watching from? Let us know below.